She silences her heels the moment she crosses the threshold. The invisible code has already begun. In 1957, the Sunday morning sanctuary was not simply a place of worship. It was the social center of American life. Gallup polling from that era confirmed that 49% of Americans attended church every single week, the highest rate ever recorded in this country. That number has never been matched since. The church was where you were seen, where your family's reputation lived, and where the unspoken rules of community life were performed in full view of everyone who mattered to you. Why 1957 specifically? Because by that year, post-war prosperity had given American families something they had not had in a generation: stability. The Depression was a memory. The war was over. Men were home. Neighborhoods were filling up, and the new suburbs were built around the church as their anchor. Community identity and personal identity were almost the same thing in 1957, and Sunday morning was where both were put on full display. The etiquette code was not a holdover from some distant Victorian past. It was alive, practiced, and enforced right then. Here is the thing that gets lost when people look back at this era. The women who carried these rules were not passive. They were not simply following orders handed down by husbands or clergymen. They were the architects of this social world. Mothers taught daughters. Older women in the congregation corrected younger ones with a single look, a quiet word, or the deliberate example of doing it correctly. The etiquette code of the 1957 church was built, maintained, and passed down almost entirely by women, and they took that responsibility seriously. The dignity of Sunday morning was built on Saturday night. That is not a metaphor. Etiquette authorities of the era, Amy Vanderbilt chief among them, were explicit on this point. Sunday preparations began the evening before, without exception. Shoes were polished, dresses were pressed and hung. The Sunday roast was prepped and ready for the oven. Hair was set on pin curls or rollers so it would be perfectly shaped by morning. A woman who arrived at church looking serene and unhurried had almost certainly spent her Saturday evening making that serenity possible. Saturday night bath for children is remembered now as a quaint old custom, maybe even a joke about how infrequently people bathed. But in the 1950s household, it was a precision time management tool. A mother who bathed her children on Saturday evening eliminated the single biggest source of Sunday morning chaos: wet hair, damp towels, and the scramble to get small bodies clean and dressed before the service began. Sunday morning was protected time. The bath the night before was how you protected it. The ritual was less about hygiene and more about keeping Sunday morning calm and intentional. Amy Vanderbilt published her complete book of etiquette in 1952, and it became the closest thing post-war America had to a secular scripture for homemakers. Vanderbilt was clear and unapologetic. The well-run Sunday morning was the product of deliberate Saturday evening effort. She was not describing a burden. She was describing a skill. The ability to walk into a church on Sunday morning looking composed, on time, and fully prepared was a mark of competence that every woman in that congregation could read at a glance. It was not luck, it was craft. Rule 1. A woman's head was always covered before she entered a house of worship. This was not a suggestion, and it was not optional. For Protestant women, that meant a hat. For Catholic women, it meant a hat or a mantilla. The style, the color, the material all varied by denomination, by season, and by personal taste, but the covering itself was non-negotiable. A woman who walked into a church sanctuary in 1957 with her head bare was not making a fashion statement. She was committing a social error that every other woman in the building would notice immediately and remember. Protestant women and Catholic women followed the same fundamental rule, but expressed it in two entirely different visual languages. A Protestant woman might wear a structured pillbox hat in dove gray, a wide-brimmed straw hat in summer, or a small felt hat with a grosgrain ribbon in autumn. A Catholic woman might wear any of those same styles, but she also had the option of the mantilla, a lace veil that draped over the head and shoulders with a quiet, particular elegance. The mantilla required no hat pin, no stiff brim, and no worry about the ceiling of a low doorway. Same rule, two distinct expressions, and every woman knew which one belonged to her tradition. For Catholic women in 1957, the head covering was not simply a social expectation. It was church law. The 1917 Code of Canon Law, specifically Canon 1262, mandated that women cover their heads in church. This was not a regional custom or a parish preference. It was a binding rule of the Universal Catholic Church. That canon was not officially relaxed until the 1970s and was not formally removed from the code until 1983. So in 1957, a Catholic woman who left her house without a hat or mantilla was not just breaking an etiquette rule. She was technically in violation of canon law. There was a small, quiet ritual that happened in the vestibule of nearly every American church in 1957. And most people who witnessed it probably did not even register it consciously. A woman would pause just inside the outer door, turn slightly toward whatever mirror or reflective surface was available, and check her hat pin. Just a brief touch, a small adjustment, a confirmation that everything was secure. It was 30 seconds of self-command before stepping into a room full of people who would notice everything. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. Rule 2. Bare shoulders were forbidden in the sanctuary, and the heat of a July morning in an unair-conditioned church building was not considered a valid exemption. In the summer of 1957, most American church buildings had no air conditioning at all. The temperature inside a packed sanctuary on a July Sunday could climb well past 80 degrees, and still, a sleeveless dress required a covering. This was not cruelty. It was a standard that every woman in the building was holding herself to equally, and that shared standard was itself a form of respect. A woman who owned a sleeveless summer dress and wanted to wear it to church had exactly 3 acceptable solutions: the Bolero jacket, a short, structured jacket that covered the shoulders and upper arms and could be matched to the dress fabric; the cardigan, a lightweight knit that could be draped or buttoned, depending on the formality of the occasion; and the stole, a length of fabric worn across the shoulders that added coverage without adding weight. Each of these had its own social register. The bolero was the most formal. The stole was the most elegant. The cardigan was the most practical. A woman who knew her codes knew which one to reach for. Rule 3. Gloves were worn to church. That was the baseline. But there was a second layer to the glove rule that separated the women who truly knew the code from those who were simply following the broad outline of it. The right glove came off in the vestibule. Before you entered the sanctuary, if there was any chance, you would be shaking the pastor's hand. You did not shake hands with a glove on. That was considered a barrier, a coldness, an unwillingness to make genuine contact. The glove came off. It was folded neatly into the left hand, and the bare right hand was offered warmly. The glove code had a detail that could trip up even a reasonably well-dressed woman if she had not been properly taught. Glove length was not a matter of personal preference. It was a matter of time of day and occasion. Sunday morning church required short gloves, wrist length, almost always in white cotton. Elbow-length gloves were strictly for evening formal wear, dinner parties, the theater, formal dances. A woman who arrived at Sunday morning service in elbow-length gloves was not overdressed. She was socially misaligned in a way that marked her as someone who did not quite understand the system, and the women around her would have known it instantly. In the 1957 Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog, a pair of white cotton wrist-length gloves cost 98 cents. 98 cents. And yet those gloves were treated with the same care and intention as a garment that cost 10 times as much. They were washed carefully, dried flat, and stored in tissue paper. They were inspected before Sunday morning for any gray at the fingertips or any loose stitching at the hem. A pair of 98-cent gloves, worn and maintained with that level of attention, communicated something that no price tag could buy. It communicated that you understood what Sunday morning meant. Rule 4. The communion glove rule. You never, under any circumstances, handled the communion wafer or the communion bread with a gloved hand. This applied to both Protestant and Catholic women, though the mechanics of communion differed by denomination. The glove was a social garment. The communion element was a sacred one. Mixing the two was a category error that no properly raised woman would make. If you had forgotten to remove your glove before the communion plate reached your row, you removed it quietly and quickly in the pew before reaching for the bread. No fumbling, no explanation, no drawing attention. You simply handled it correctly. Rule 5. Scuffed heels were not a minor oversight. In the social arithmetic of the 1957 congregation, scuffed heels on a Sunday morning read as a sign of a disorganized homemaker. The logic was direct. If you could not manage the basic maintenance of your own footwear, what did that say about the management of your household? This sounds harsh by modern standards, and perhaps it was. But in a community where every detail was visible and every detail was read, the condition of your shoes was a piece of evidence that the women around you would weigh without ever saying a word about it aloud. The Saturday night shoe polishing ritual was one of those household acts that carried more meaning than its practical function suggested. A man might polish his own shoes, and his wife might polish hers, or in many households it was a shared task done together at the kitchen table after the children were bathed and in bed. The shoes came out, the newspaper went down, the tin of kiwi polish was opened, and the work was done quietly and thoroughly. By Sunday morning, those shoes were ready, and when a woman walked up the church steps in shoes that caught the light, the congregation did not see the Saturday night labor. They saw the result of it. That was the point. Rule 6. The hemline standard. A skirt or dress hem sat strictly below the knee, and that standard applied not just when you were standing, but when you were seated in a pew, and when you were kneeling. Many women who sewed their own Sunday clothes, and in 1957 a great many did, would check the hem length in all three positions before considering the garment finished. Standing length was only part of the calculation. A hem that rode up when seated or that fell awkwardly when kneeling was a hem that had not been properly thought through. The modesty standard was not a single measurement. It was a test the dress had to pass in 3 different positions. Now here is a rule that surprises people every time I mention it. The girdle. In 1957, a proper foundation garment was not about vanity or fitting into a smaller dress size. It was about posture. Those hard wooden pews in older churches offered no lumbar support whatsoever, and a woman who slouched, who let her spine curve and her shoulders round forward during a 40-minute sermon, was considered just as out of place as a woman who arrived without her hat. The foundation garment was structural. It kept a woman upright, composed, and present in her body for the full length of the service. And here is where the foundation requirement takes a darker turn that history has mostly forgotten. For Catholic women in 1957, the discipline of Sunday morning was doubled. Canon Law required fasting from midnight until the moment of receiving communion at morning mass. No food, no water, nothing. Now combine that strict fast with a tightly laced foundation garment, a crowded parish with no air conditioning, and a July morning in the American South or Midwest, and you have a recipe for a medical event. Women fainted in church with enough regularity that it was anticipated, not shocking, in many parishes. The fainting was common enough that experienced women in the congregation knew exactly what to do. A quiet word to the usher, a swift and dignified escort to the vestibule, a glass of water from the sacristy. Nobody made a scene. Nobody whispered excessively. The woman recovered, smoothed her skirt, and often returned to her pew before the sermon ended. That response, that collective, practiced calm in the face of a medical moment, tells you something important about how tightly this community operated. They had rehearsed every contingency without ever holding a meeting about it. Let us talk about money for a moment, because the sacrifice behind Sunday best was real and it was significant. The 1957 Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog listed a standard women's Sunday dress at somewhere between $8.98 and $14.95. In today's purchasing power, that is roughly $95 to $160. For a family living on a single post-war income, that dress represented genuine financial commitment. And the white cotton wrist-length gloves that completed the look? 98 cents. Every penny of it chosen deliberately, maintained carefully, and worn with full intention. And this is the myth I want to dismantle right now, because it still floats around whenever people talk about this era. Sunday best was never about showing off. It was not a wealth competition. Many women in a 1957 congregation owned exactly one good dress. One. It hung in the closet all week, pressed and protected, and it came out on Sunday morning. The woman who wore it was not signaling prosperity. She was signaling respect. Respect for the institution, for the community seated beside her, and for the idea that some things in life deserve your absolute best effort, even when, especially when, that effort costs you something. Here is something the history books tend to overlook entirely. These rules were not handed down by men standing at pulpits. Women were the primary architects and enforcers of this entire social code. Mothers taught daughters from the time they could walk. Older women in the congregation kept watch over the younger ones with a patience that was also, let us be honest, a kind of authority. A raised eyebrow from the right woman in the third pew could correct a young bride's posture faster than any printed etiquette guide ever could. The code lived in women, was carried by women, and was defended by women. Rule 8. The Pew Slide. This one sounds almost too simple to be a rule, but the social weight behind it was considerable. If you arrived before the service began and chose a pew, you did not park yourself at the aisle end and make every late arrival squeeze past your knees. You slid all the way to the center. You made room. The aisle seat was not a privilege you held simply because you got there first. It was a position of service held for those who needed to exit quickly, for mothers with small children, for elderly parishioners with stiff joints. You slid in and you left the edge open. And beneath the Pew Slide Rule lived a whole unspoken geography that every regular member understood without a single conversation about it. The Hendersons always sat in the fourth pew on the left. Mrs. Kowalski, the widow, had the third pew on the right, the one closest to the side aisle, so she could leave without a fuss. The young families with toddlers clustered near the back. The choir members' families took the middle section. Nobody assigned these seats. Nobody posted a chart, but you knew. And if you were new to the congregation and accidentally sat in the wrong spot, a gentle usher would find you before the opening hymn. Rule 9. The Silence Rule. The sanctuary was for prayer, not for catching up on who had a new baby, not for comparing notes on the ladies' auxiliary bake sale, and absolutely not for commenting on another woman's hat, however tempting that might have been. The moment you crossed the threshold from the vestibule into the sanctuary proper, the social rules of the outside world were suspended. You were in a different kind of space, and your voice, your expression, your entire physical presence shifted to reflect that. The silence was not oppressive. It was a gift you gave to every other person in that room. Rule 10. The Foyer Voice. There were moments when speech in the vestibule was unavoidable. You needed to tell your daughter to straighten her hat. You needed to confirm which pew your mother-in-law was saving. Those conversations happened, but they happened at a volume that would have been appropriate in a library reading room. Not a whisper so theatrical that it drew more attention than ordinary speech, but a genuine reduction in volume, a softening of tone that communicated, "I know where I am, and I am adjusting myself accordingly." The foyer voice was not silence. It was the sound of self-awareness. I want to pause here and let you inhabit this space for a moment, because the sensory world of the 1957 vestibule was something specific and irreplaceable. Floor wax. That particular institutional floor wax smell that lived in every church, every school, every public building of the era, clean and slightly sharp and deeply familiar. Faint lilies from the altar arrangements. The soft, muffled sound of leather-soled heels being deliberately quieted on tile, a bulletin pressed into your palm by a white-gloved usher. These were not accidents. They were the physical architecture of a transition from the ordinary world into something set apart. Rule 11. The late arrival hold. If you came through those oak doors after the service had already begun, you did not simply walk down the aisle and find your seat. You stopped. You waited at the back. An usher would come to you, and he would hold you there until the congregation rose for a hymn or moved into a greeting moment. Only then would he escort you quietly to an available seat. You were never, under any circumstances, seated during a prayer, during a scripture reading, or during any moment that required the congregation's stillness. The disruption of that stillness was considered a genuine offense against everyone present. Why was interrupting a prayer or a scripture reading treated as such a serious matter? Because those moments were understood to be communal acts. When a congregation bowed its head in prayer, it was not a collection of individuals doing something private simultaneously. It was one body performing one act. To walk through that moment, to create movement and noise and distraction in the middle of it, was to break something that belonged to everyone. The late arrival rule was not about punishing the tardy. It was about protecting the integrity of a shared experience that took real effort to create and could be undone in an instant. The usher deserves his own moment here because he was not simply a man handing out bulletins. He was the quiet traffic controller of the entire sanctuary experience. He knew the pew geography. He knew which families were regulars and which visitors needed gentle orientation. He knew to seat a mother with a restless toddler near the side aisle. He knew to hold a late arrival without making her feel shamed for it. He did all of this without a word louder than a murmur, without a gesture larger than a slight inclination of his head. He was, in the language of the era, a man of good presence. Rule 12. The bulletin fold. Every Sunday, the church printed a bulletin, a folded program listing the order of service, the hymn numbers, the announcements. It was a practical document. It was also, in the heat of a July morning in a church with no air conditioning, a very tempting fan, and that temptation was to be firmly resisted. You did not fan yourself with the bulletin, not a slow wave, not a quick flutter, not even a subtle fold and fan that you thought nobody noticed. Everybody noticed, and what they saw was a woman who placed her personal comfort above the dignity of the service she was attending. What did fanning with the bulletin actually communicate to everyone within 3 pews of you? It said, "I am bored." It said, "This service is not holding my attention." It said, "My physical comfort is more important than the collective atmosphere of this space." In a community where your reputation was built and maintained Sunday by Sunday, those were not small messages to send. The woman who fanned herself was remembered, not cruelly, not maliciously, but she was noted. The etiquette of the bulletin was really the etiquette of endurance, of choosing discomfort quietly rather than advertising it. Rule 13. The kneeling posture. In churches where kneeling was part of the service, whether Catholic, Episcopal, or Lutheran, the posture of kneeling was itself governed by expectation. You knelt upright. Your back remained straight, your hands folded or resting on the pew rail in front of you, your elbows not draped heavily over the wood as though you were resting at a kitchen counter. Slumping while kneeling was considered almost as bad as slouching while seated. The physical act of kneeling was meant to express something. Collapsing into it expressed the opposite. Posture, in this world, was not separate from intention. It was the visible form of it. Rule 14. The Hymnal Hold. When the congregation rose to sing, the hymnal came out of the pew rack, and it was held properly. Chin up, the book elevated enough to allow the voice to project forward rather than down into the floor. You were not reading a recipe. You were singing with a room full of people, and your posture in that moment shaped the sound you contributed to. And if the person standing next to you, a visitor, a child, someone whose hymnal had gone missing, did not have a book, you tilted yours toward them without being asked. That small tilt was one of the most practiced acts of grace in the whole service. The shared hymnal was a small thing, a 6-inch tilt of a book. But think about what it actually was. It was a woman noticing that the person beside her was without something she needed, and correcting that without making a production of it, without waiting to be asked, without expecting acknowledgement. It happened hundreds of times every Sunday morning in churches across America. It was woven so deeply into the fabric of the service that most women who did it could not have told you afterward that they had done it at all. That is what a truly internalized social code looks like. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. Rule 15. The lipstick ban. Once you left your home on Sunday morning, your face was finished. There was no touching up in the pew, no compact mirror flipped open to check your nose. No lipstick applied between the first hymn and the sermon. The pew was not a vanity table, and treating it as one was considered a fairly significant breach of decorum. If something needed attention, you excused yourself to the powder room before the service began or waited until it was over. The rule carried a deeper logic. Your preparation was something you owed to yourself and your household before you left the door. Once you were in the sanctuary, you were present, fully and completely present. The powder room existed for a reason. Every church of any size in 1957 had one, and every well-raised woman understood its purpose with crystalline clarity. It was the designated space for anything involving your reflection, your lipstick, your hair, or your composure. The pew was not. Reaching into your handbag mid-sermon to retrieve a compact mirror was the kind of thing that earned you a look from the woman 3 seats over, the kind of look that did not require words to deliver its full message. Before she ever left her bedroom mirror on Sunday morning, a 1957 woman had already thought about the communion cup. In Protestant congregations that used a shared chalice, she knew that a full application of lipstick left a visible red ring on the rim, so she applied her color, pressed her lips firmly against a folded tissue, and left the excess behind on the paper. She arrived at church with a polished, finished look and a clean conscience. The consideration for others was literally built into her morning routine. What strikes you when you sit with this rule long enough is the sheer forethought embedded in it. She was not yet at church. She was standing in her own bedroom, and she was already thinking about the woman who would receive the cup after her. That is not a small thing. That is a habit of mind, a daily practice of imagining yourself inside the experience of another person before you have even stepped out your front door. The blotted lip was not a beauty trick. It was a philosophy of living, pressed into a tissue and left on the vanity. Perfume in 1957 was not optional for a Sunday morning. A woman was expected to be well-groomed, and that included scent. But the rule was strict. 1 dab, applied at the wrist or behind the ear, nothing more. The reason was entirely practical and entirely considerate. Church pews in 1957 were packed tightly. Most sanctuaries had no air conditioning. A service ran 60 to 90 minutes. In that environment, a heavy application of Chanel No. 5 or white shoulders did not smell elegant. It became a presence of its own, and not a welcome one. Think about the arithmetic of a packed Sunday pew. You are seated shoulder to shoulder with 5 or 6 other people. The windows are closed against the morning chill, or propped open just enough to let in summer heat without a breeze. The woman to your left has worn a full cloud of gardenia. The woman to your right has done the same. You are now sitting inside a fragrance collision for the better part of an hour while trying to focus on the sermon. Your scent in that room was not yours alone. It belonged to everyone within arm's reach. The 1 dab rule acknowledged that plainly. A single clean tissue tucked into the sleeve or at the wrist of the glove. That was the rule, and it was one of the most quietly ingenious pieces of practical etiquette in the entire Sunday morning code. Sniffles happened. Allergies did not observe the church calendar. A sudden need to dab your eyes during a moving hymn was entirely possible. The sleeve tissue meant you never had to open your handbag, never had to rustle through its contents, never had to disturb the row while searching for a handkerchief. It was simply there, invisible, and ready. The genius of the sleeve tissue was that it solved three problems at once. Your hands remained free for the hymnal, your handbag stayed closed and silent, and your composure stayed intact during a long sermon that might run 40 minutes or more. There was no fumbling, no distraction, no apology to the woman beside you. The tissue was already where it needed to be, because someone had thought ahead. That is the thread running through every single one of these rules: radical preparation in service of communal peace. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. The vestibule umbrella stands were not decorative. They were load-bearing pieces of church infrastructure, and using them was not optional. A woman who carried a dripping umbrella down the aisle to her pew was committing two offenses simultaneously. She was bringing the weather inside a space that was meant to be set apart from the ordinary world, and she was creating a genuine hazard: wet wood warps. A dripping umbrella held over a neighbor's hem left a watermark that did not come out before the Sunday dinner guests arrived. The stands existed. You used them. It is easy to dismiss the umbrella rule as trivial until you consider what it actually protected. A woman in 1957 might own one good wool skirt. One. It was pressed on Saturday, worn on Sunday, and expected to last several more years. A careless umbrella dripping across that hem was not a minor inconvenience. It was damage to something irreplaceable, and the woman who caused it would have known, by the expression of the woman beside her, exactly what she had done. These rules were not abstract social performances. They had real material consequences for real women in real wool skirts. Stop for a moment and consider what the last 19 rules, taken together, actually describe. A woman who covered her head in respect for the space, who removed her right glove before offering her hand, who blotted her lipstick at home for the sake of a stranger at the communion cup, who tucked a tissue at her wrist so she would never have to rustle through her bag, who left her umbrella at the door so no one's hem would suffer. These were not restrictions placed upon her. They were a portrait, rule by rule, of a woman who had trained herself to think about other people before she thought about herself. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore. These 19 rules were never published in a pamphlet and handed out at the door. They were transmitted the way all real social knowledge travels, from mother to daughter, from the older woman in the fourth pew to the younger bride in the second, through a look, a quiet word after the service, a gentle correction delivered with such warmth that the recipient felt guided rather than shamed. The architecture of this world was maintained by women, for women, and it worked precisely because it was never formally written down. If a baby fussed, you left. That was the entirety of Rule 20, and it required no elaboration in 1957. There were no cry rooms built into the architecture of most American churches. There were no nursing lounges, no sound-dampened glass panels, no amplified speaker feeds piped into a side room. There was the sanctuary, and there was the vestibule, and if your child was making noise that interrupted the service, you picked up that child, gathered your things with one quiet motion, and you walked out, swiftly, silently, without waiting to see if the fussing would stop on its own. The mother's quiet exit was, in effect, the cry room. She was it. She was the acoustic solution. And the reason this worked, the reason it did not feel punishing to the women who practiced it, was that it was understood on both sides. The congregation knew she would return when the child settled. She knew they appreciated the gesture. The exit was not a banishment. It was a contribution to the shared experience of the service, an act of respect for the 60 or 70 other people who had also arranged their entire Saturday night to be present and attentive on Sunday morning. What the swift exit communicated was something deeper than mere courtesy. It said, "I understand that this space and this hour do not belong to me alone." It said, "My comfort and even my child's comfort is secondary to the collective experience of worship." That is a significant thing to say with your body, without words, in the middle of a Sunday morning. Modern culture has largely lost the vocabulary for that kind of self-subordination in public space. We have optimized for individual comfort so thoroughly that the idea of inconveniencing yourself for a room full of strangers can feel almost foreign. The collection plate moved down the row with a specific choreography that every couple understood before they ever sat down. The husband held the offering envelope. When the plate reached him, he placed it in with a quiet, unhurried motion. His wife's job was to receive the plate from him and pass it gracefully to the next person, without opening her handbag, without fishing for loose change, without creating any pause in the plate's smooth journey down the row. The transaction was clean, dignified, and over in 4 seconds. That was the standard, and anything less was noticed. The collection plate rule was really about something larger than money. It was about the visible demonstration that this family had prepared. The envelope was prepared at home, on Saturday, with the correct amount already inside. There was no last-minute arithmetic, no whispered negotiation about how much to give, no digging through a coin purse while the usher waited with practiced patience. The preparation was invisible by Sunday morning, which was precisely the point. Every graceful moment in the sanctuary was the product of invisible work done the day before. That is the architecture of this entire code. Sunday dinner in 1957 did not cook itself on Sunday morning. A proper roast, the kind that appeared on the table an hour after the family returned from church, required preparation that began the night before. The potatoes were peeled and sitting in cold water in the icebox. The roast was seasoned and ready to go into the oven the moment she walked back through the door in her good shoes. Vegetables were trimmed. The table was set. Amy Vanderbilt, whose etiquette books were on the shelves of serious homemakers across America, was explicit on this point. Sunday morning was not for cooking. It was for attending. The Saturday dinner preparation was not simply a logistical solution to a scheduling problem. It was an act of spiritual intention, though most women of that era would not have used those words. What it said was this: Sunday morning belongs to something other than domestic labor. By doing the work on Saturday, she was protecting the sanctity of the morning itself. She was ensuring that when she walked through those church doors, her mind was not still back in the kitchen, calculating whether the roast had enough time. She had already given Sunday morning the gift of her full attention the night before. The receiving line after the service was one of the most precisely governed social moments of the entire Sunday morning. You approached the pastor at the door. You made direct eye contact. You offered your right hand, which was already ungloved. You said something specific about the sermon, not a vague compliment, but something that proved you had been listening. Your point about the parable of the talents was exactly what I needed this week, Pastor. 12 words, genuine, brief, and done. Then you stepped to the side and kept moving, because behind you stood 40 more people with the same intention. The art of the brief compliment at the pastor's door was more sophisticated than it appears. It required you to have actually listened during the service, which was itself a form of discipline. It required you to distill what you heard into a single genuine observation, delivered warmly and without excess. And it required you to then stop talking, which for many people is the hardest part of any social exchange. The women who did this well were practicing a skill that has almost entirely disappeared from modern social life: the gracious exit from a conversation, executed at exactly the right moment, leaving the other person feeling honored rather than abandoned. What holding up the pastor's receiving line communicated was not enthusiasm or devotion. It communicated that you had not learned to read a room. Every woman behind you in that line was wearing her good shoes, standing on a hard stone step, and waiting with quiet patience. The receiving line was a ritual of efficiency wrapped in warmth. You got in, you gave your genuine word, and you moved on. That was the whole art of it. Rule 24 was one of the most spatially precise rules in the entire code. Neighborhood news, school gossip, and plans for the coming week all had their place. That place was the front steps, the church lawn, or the sidewalk beyond the iron gate. Never the sanctuary, never the vestibule. The interior of the building held a different register of behavior, and the moment you stepped back through those oak doors, the social chatter was supposed to stop as naturally as a radio being switched off. The front steps of an American church in 1957 were something genuinely remarkable. They were a social stage, an outdoor parlor, a weekly town square compressed into 20 minutes. Neighbors who had not spoken since the previous Sunday caught up on births and illnesses, and who had sold their house on Maple Street. The steps were where the community exhaled. They served a real function, and that function was protected precisely because it was kept separate from what happened inside. There was an invisible boundary in every American church in 1957, and every woman understood exactly where it ran. It ran at the threshold of the sanctuary door. On one side, the sacred interior, where you moved quietly and spoke to God. On the other side, the social exterior, where you moved freely and spoke to your neighbors. That boundary was not policed by a rule in any handbook. It was maintained by collective understanding, and it gave both spaces their full dignity. When the boundary dissolved, both spaces lost something they have never entirely recovered. Rule 25 was the one that tied every other rule together. It was the philosophy underneath the hat and the gloves and the polished shoes. Your absolute finest clothing was reserved for Sunday morning, not Saturday night. Not the country club dance, not the neighbor's dinner party. Sunday morning. The idea was simple and it was serious. The place where your community gathered to acknowledge something larger than itself deserved the best version of you that you could put forward. That was the whole argument, and it needed no further explanation. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down. Giving your best was not a performance of wealth. It was a form of respect, offered freely and publicly to the people you shared a community with. The woman who pressed her one good dress on Saturday night and wore it with her 98-cent white cotton gloves on Sunday morning was not pretending to be wealthy. She was communicating something far more durable than wealth. She was saying, "This place and these people are worth my very best effort." That message landed every single time. There is a myth worth setting aside directly. The myth is that these rules were imposed on women by the institutions or the men around them. The historical record tells a different story. Women were the primary architects and the primary enforcers of this entire code. Mothers taught daughters. Older women in the congregation corrected younger ones with nothing more than a steady look across the aisle. The etiquette was carried, defended, and transmitted almost entirely by women. They were not victims of the code. They were its authors. What was lost when these codes dissolved in the late 1960s and early 1970s was not the rules themselves. Rules can always be written down again. What was lost was the shared language. When every woman in a room of 300 people operates on the same unspoken understanding, the room has a coherence that no posted sign can replicate. The codes created a kind of social grammar. And when the grammar disappeared, people did not stop communicating. They simply lost the shared vocabulary for doing it gracefully in that particular space. Here is something worth sitting with. The instinct did not actually disappear. We still dress with deliberate intention for weddings and funerals. We still lower our voices in hospital corridors and at gravesides. We still understand, without being told, that some spaces ask something different of us than the grocery store does. The old code was not an aberration. It was a highly developed expression of an instinct that is still alive in us. What 1957 had that we largely lack now is a shared agreement about which spaces triggered it and exactly what it required. When you step back and look at all 25 rules together, a single phrase comes into focus. What 1957 church etiquette actually was is this: choreographed mutual respect, performed by an entire community, without a director and without a script. Every woman who slid to the center of the pew, blotted her lipstick before leaving the house, and tucked a clean tissue into her glove was participating in something larger than personal preference. She was contributing her part to a collective performance of consideration. And the remarkable thing is that she did it every single week without being asked. There is a quiet indignation in looking at what happened to these codes. They were not reformed. They were not replaced with something equally thoughtful. They were simply discarded, quickly and without ceremony, in the cultural upheaval of the late 1960s, and the gap they left has never been filled. We did not develop a new shared language for how to inhabit communal spaces with grace. We simply stopped having the conversation. The women who carried these rules deserved better than to have their life's work called irrelevant, and walked away from without a second thought. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. Every single one of these 25 rules rests on a foundation that has not aged a day. Remove the hat mandate, and what remains is the principle of preparation and intentionality. Remove the glove protocol, and what remains is the principle of reading a social situation and adjusting your behavior accordingly. Remove the bulletin fold, and what remains is the principle of not communicating boredom in a space where others are fully present. The rules were the expression. The consideration underneath them is permanent. The women who carried this code through every Sunday morning of the 1950s were not rule followers in the passive sense. They were social engineers, working without a title or a salary. They built and maintained the architecture of an entire community's shared life, one pressed dress and one silent exit and one blotted lipstick at a time. They deserve to be remembered not as women who were told what to do, but as women who understood what they were doing and why it mattered. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and it is worth going back for. I would love to know which of these rules your mother or grandmother kept without ever explaining why. Was it the gloves? The hat? The Saturday night shoe polish? Leave it in the comments below, because those small memories are exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to preserve. If this felt like something worth holding on to, subscribe to Clara's Forgotten Manners, and I will see you next time with another piece of the world that deserves to be remembered.